In this tutorial, we're going to look at setting up the chemical screen. We're in main menu at the moment. We go to setup menu into chemicals. The first field in the top left-hand corner of the screen is the chemicals field. In this field, you will write the full name of the chemical. Just make sure that you do write the full name. If there's any WPs or numbers that come after it, include it, because this is the field that will be transferred into your spray diary record. And in that record, the name of the chemical has to be complete. The next field to the right hand side is type. This is a set list, and every chemical needs to be categorized to a type. Some of those types may not be a perfect fit, but every chemical needs to go into one of those categories, and it doesn't matter if it's not a perfect fit. It's really just so that if you want to pull up a fungicide report or a herbicide report, it knows what chemicals to report on. The next box down is the active ingredient. Depending on the quality assurance regime that you're working under, you may or may not be required to include the active ingredient in your spray diary report. If you're not required to do it, then you really don't need to fill in that field, but if you are, then it must be filled in. To the left, you have the price per kilo or litre. You're not required to fill in this field. If you're not interested in tracking your costings, then you don't need to fill this field in. But if you are, then I'd suggest that you put the prices in at the beginning of the process rather than later on down the track, because what happens is that the record is created with the price that is prevalent at the time. So if the price is zero, then that's the price that we'll put against that chemical. If you put the price of this chemical back into this field later on, it won't go back and update the old records. And there's an obvious reason for that. If that was happening, all the old prices would keep being updated with new prices each time there was a price change. So if you do want to keep track of your prices, do it earlier rather than later. We have a withholding period box, which is really just nothing more than putting in the days prior to harvest in there. The program will be referencing the varieties setup screen, and in the variety setup screen you're asked to put down your earliest likely pick date. And the program, when you're using a chemical with a withholding period, will look that variety up and check to see if there is likely to be an infringement. If there is, it will give you a warning message saying that you are likely to be spraying too close to a harvest date. Now, it may be that you know that the harvest date is now actually going to be a couple of weeks later, and that's fine, you can use a chemical, but you do get the warning. The next field across is a re-entry. Any chemical you have that has a restriction on re-entry to a block, if you put that number of days restriction in there, when you use that chemical, it will ask you if you want to produce a warning sheet, and that warning sheet will have on it the name of the block, the name of the chemical, and the date that the block will come out of restriction. And also, if you do try and do another spray diary entry against that block while there's a restriction in place, you'll also get a warning. The next box along is a resistance group. This is simply a way of keeping track of chemicals by resistance groups, how many times you've applied it to a particular block, and there is a report available that you can look up a block and just see how many times a particular resistance group has been applied to a block. Coming back to the left-hand side, there is the rate default screen. You may have some chemicals that don't have a default rate and have quite variable rates to be applied, and in that case you may not want to use a default rate at all, which is fine. You can put the rate in at the time you're creating the record, but for most chemicals there will be a set label rate, and it's best to have it put in there. The two things that need to go with this rate is, one is the decision to be made about whether the rate is going to be rate per 100 litres or rate per hectare. Generally find that foliar sprays are calculated as rate per 100 litres and ground sprays such as herbicides as rate per hectare, but that is purely a decision that you need to make. But each chemical, you need to make a decision on whether that chemical is going to be calculated one way or the other. The other thing that you'll notify in there is whether it's a liquid or a solid. This makes it easy for the program whenever it's printing reports or instruction sheets to talk in terms of kilos or litres, grams or mils, without you having to write it up. The rate itself is expressed as a decimal. So if it's, for instance, 2 kilos or 2 litres, it will be simply 2.0. Half a litre, 0.5. 100 mils or 100 grams is 0.1. 10 mil or 10 grams is 0.01. So just make sure that you've got your decimal place in the right spot. The batch number box probably doesn't need to be activated either. The times when certain chemicals required a batch number have pretty much gone. It's now generally either all batch numbers have to be collected or none, depending on the quality assurance program you're in. If you have a situation where certain chemicals have to have batch numbers attached to them, then certainly use that checkbox, and every time you use the chemical you'll be advised to get a batch number. But generally these days it is either you get all batch numbers or you get none. Off to the right there is a tick box to discontinue use. What this does is stops the chemical being shown in the drop-down boxes. The chemical will still remain in this screen, as it has records against it. You can't just make a chemical go away. There is history involved, and it may be a time when, if you need to pull up a report where that chemical was actually used, the chemical needs to be in the system. On the right hand side we have the element percentage weight for fertilizers. So the NPK, if you fill out the NPK or element makeup of all your fertilizers as they're applied to blocks, and regardless of whether that application is done as a foliar spray or a dry application or fertigation, it's keeping track of how much NPK has been applied to the block, which can be quite handy when you're trying to ascertain what's happening with soil tests and leaf tests, etc. That pretty much covers the chemical screen. It suggests that you get all your chemicals in before you start doing spray diary. It can be quite messy having to come back in and set up chemicals that you've missed. Once this is set up, the only changes you'll be making to this screen is probably prices. There is an area in the enter data screen which is your purchases area, and part of the process of entering purchases also enters the price that you've paid for that chemical, and it refers back to this screen to look and see if there has been a price change since the last purchase, and you'll be notified if there is, and you'll be given the opportunity to update the price then.